My brother received the keys to 9 trucks. He received the contracts, residential, commercial, the Knoxville business park account that my father mentioned at every family gathering for 11 years. He received the equipment, the fleet, the client relationships, the name on the side of the vehicles, and 30 years of a man's working life, handed across a table by an estate attorney in a beige conference room on a Tuesday afternoon in May. I received a sealed envelope, my name on the front in my father's handwriting, a single key taped inside, and an address, Ridgeline Storage, Merchant Drive, Unit 14, written on a small card in the same hand that had signed every check, every contract, every loan form for my brother's education. For 30 years of a business I was never invited into. Everyone in that room felt sorry for me. I was the only one who already knew that sorry was the wrong thing to feel. My name is Fiona Callahan. I'm 31 years old. I am the owner of Callahan Studio, a landscape architecture and design firm in Asheville, North Carolina, that I built from nothing, which is to say, from the specific nothing my father left me for 22 years before he left me a key. And this is the story of the storage unit, and the boxes, and the 4 pages in my father's handwriting that explained everything I had waited my whole life to understand. Let me start at the table, because everything starts at the table. I was 9 years old the first time I understood that there were 2 kinds of children in my family's house, and I was one of them and my brother Scott was the other. I understood it not from anything dramatic, not from a fight, not from a declaration, but from the specific direction of my father's eyes at dinner. Donald Callahan talked about the business the way other men talk about the weather or the news. It was the texture of his daily life, the thing he was thinking about when he wasn't thinking about anything else. Callahan Green, the trucks, the clients, the crew. He talked about it to Scott. Scott was 2 years older than me. At 11, he was my father's audience for these conversations. By 13, he was a participant. By 14, he was an employee. Weekends first, then summers, then part-time through high school. Paid. Given responsibility. Taught the inside of the business from the year he was old enough to drive a mower. I sat at the same table. I had always sat at the same table. My father was not a man who excluded me with cruelty. He excluded me the way you exclude a piece of furniture, which is to say without noticing. The conversation simply went around me, the way water goes around a stone in a creek. Not because the stone is in the way, but because the water already knows its path. When I was 15, I asked if I could work summers too. I had been playing competitive soccer for 6 years. I was 5'7". I was stronger than my brother and faster, and I genuinely, from somewhere deep and specific, loved being outside and green things. I had been reading my father's trade catalogs in secret for 3 years by then, sitting cross-legged on the floor of his home office when he wasn't there, looking at the plant species profiles, the soil amendment guides, the before and after photos of commercial installations. I did not know yet that what I was feeling had a professional name. I just knew the catalogs felt like mine. My father said, "It's physical work, Fiona. It's not really suited." He said it without meanness. He was not trying to exclude me. He was simply telling me, with complete sincerity, what category I belonged in. And it was not the category that worked alongside him. I found a job at a garden center that summer. I worked there for 3 years. I never told my father how much I loved it. I understood, by then, that what I loved was not information he was asking for. If you have ever grown up in a family where your achievements were greeted with genuine indifference, where the issue was not cruelty but invisibility, drop a comment. Tell me how long it took you to stop trying to get their attention and start building something that didn't require it. Because the transition is not a moment, it's a slow reorientation. And I know from the stories this channel carries that it happens on a different schedule for every person who has lived it. If this is finding you at the right moment, subscribe. There's a new one here every week. In 2011, when I was 18, I was accepted to the landscape architecture program at NC State. It is one of the best programs in the country. I had worked for it, the application, the portfolio, the personal statement, in the specific way you work for something when you know no one is going to help you and the work is yours alone. I brought the acceptance letter to dinner. I laid it on the table. My father picked it up. He looked at it. He set it back down. He set it back down. He said, "Landscape architecture." "So you want to draw pictures of what other people build." He said it without malice. That was the consistent quality of my father's cruelty. It was never malicious, which meant it was never something I could point to and say that. That was the thing. It was just the steady, sincere expression of a man who did not consider his daughter's ambitions serious, stated plainly at a dinner table, in the tone of someone describing an interesting but slightly impractical hobby. He signed Scott's loan forms for a business management degree at a state school in Tennessee the same month. He paid Scott's tuition in full. I took out $67,000 in student loans and went to NC State anyway. I paid every cent of it myself. I want to stop here and be honest about something, because this story does not work if I let you believe I was purely the wronged party and my father was purely the villain. Donald Callahan was a man of his generation and his class and his specific formation, a man who had built something with his hands and his will and who believed, without ever examining the belief, that what he had built was for his son, not from cruelty, from the architecture of a worldview he had never been asked to question. He loved me. I am certain of that, in the way you are certain of things that are painful rather than comforting. He just could not figure out how to love a daughter who wanted to be in the same room as the thing he cared most about. The invisible decade, I call it in my own head. The years between my leaving for NC State in 2011 and my father's death in 2024. The years during which Callahan Green continued to grow. 2 additional trucks in 2016, new commercial contracts, 3 additional crew members in 2019, and I received none of this information directly, only through the Christmas dinner dispatches. The business updates delivered between my father and my brother at the table I still came back to every December. The property management company wants us to bid 3 more sites in the spring. We're going to need another truck. And then as an afterthought, rotating toward me briefly, how's Asheville? How's Asheville? 10 years of my professional life, summarized as a geographic location. What he did not ask about, what was never discussed, what my father never once raised at those dinner tables, Callahan Studio, which I began building in 2018, quietly, the way I had always built things. Alone, without announcement, without asking anyone's permission. I completed my landscape architect licensure. I saved $34,000 in a dedicated account I did not mention. I built a client pipeline through 3 years of strategic professional groundwork. I launched the firm in January 2021. Year 1 revenue, $112,000. Year 2, $280,000. Year 3, $480,000. 4 employees. A commercial client base in Asheville that I had developed through work that was, by any professional measure, excellent. My father never asked about it. I never offered. We had a deal, unspoken, that had been in place since I was 15. His world had a shape, and my presence in it was defined by that shape, and neither of us was going to unsettle it by pointing at the edges. I kept building, he kept not asking. In October of 2023, 6 months before he died, my brother called to tell me that my father had updated his will and that everything was being kept together. He said it the way you mention a logistical detail, briskly, helpfully, as if you were doing me a courtesy by giving me advance preparation time. I understood what it meant. I sat with it that night, alone, in my apartment in Asheville. And I let myself feel the full weight of the unsurprise. Because that is the specific pain of being the child who always knew. The injury is not the revelation. It is the confirmation of something you have been carrying for decades. And the confirmation is both smaller and larger than you expected. I did not call my father to discuss it. I went to the studio the next morning and met with a client about a residential terrace project in Biltmore Park. The design challenges were interesting. I focused on those. Donald Callahan died on March 28, 2024. He had been in declining health for 18 months after a cardiac diagnosis. He died in the hospital on a Thursday morning. I drove from Asheville to Knoxville that afternoon. My brother was already there. My mother was small and still in the way that people become small and still when the person they organize their life around is suddenly not in it anymore. I sat with her. I made tea. I was useful in the ways I knew how to be useful. I did not think about the will during that time. Or I tried not to. I did not entirely succeed. The will reading was May 7, 2024. The offices of Hargrove & Associates, a beige carpeted suite on the third floor of an office building in Knoxville that smelled like recycled air and old paper. Charles Hargrove was a careful man in his 60s who had clearly been managing the expectations of families in these rooms for a long time. Scott was there with his wife Amber. My mother. Me. Hargrove read the will in the formal way, because Donald had requested a formal reading. The business transfer was first, unambiguous, complete, the whole of Callahan Green to Scott in terms that left no interpretive room: the trucks, the contracts, the equipment, the accounts, the name. The family home to my mother for her lifetime, then to both children equally, to me, and here is the moment I had been preparing for since October: a personal bequest of $8,000 in cash, described in the will as to my daughter Fiona with love. And the envelope. Hargrove produced it from a larger document envelope where it had been held per Donald's instructions. He handed it to me. It was a standard white envelope, slightly thicker than you would expect. My name on the front. My father's handwriting. The same handwriting that had been on birthday cards I had received every year without fail. Cards that always said love. Dad in the same careful print, nothing else. Scott said, "What's in the envelope?" Hargrove said it was a personal letter. The Donald's instructions were for it to be given to me privately. Scott looked at me. He said, "What's in the envelope?" I put it in my bag. I said, "I'll let you know." I did not open it in that room. I was not going to open it in that room, in front of those people, with Scott watching my face for information. I drove 4 blocks to a coffee shop. I ordered a black coffee and sat at a corner table by the window. I held the envelope for a moment. Then I opened it. Inside was 1 page, folded in thirds. In my father's handwriting, a brief note. He wrote that he knew he hadn't always done right by me. He wrote that the key, which was taped to the inside of the envelope, a small silver key on a plain ring, was for Unit 14 at Ridgeline Storage on Merchant Drive. He wrote 3 words I have thought about many times since. He wrote, "Go alone first." That was it. 1 page. The key. The address. 4 sentences. I drank my coffee. I sat at the window and looked at the street for a while. I thought about my father's handwriting, how I had seen it my entire life, on birthday cards and grocery lists and the edges of trade catalogs, and how little of it had ever been addressed directly to me. Then I got in my car. Ridgeline Storage is on the east side of Knoxville, a standard climate-controlled facility in a low beige building with orange roll-up doors and a gravel lot. I arrived at 6:40 p.m. Unit 14 was in the back row. I lifted the rolling door. I turned on my phone flashlight because the overhead light in the unit was burned out. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at what was inside. 41 banker's boxes, organized by year, the labels in my father's handwriting, year by year from 2009 through 2023. 3 fireproof document cases, stacked along the left wall. A locked metal cash box on the floor beside them. And on top of the first document case, unsealed, sitting in the beam of my flashlight, a second envelope. My name on the front. Open. He had left it open on purpose. So I would read it before I went through anything else, so I would know the why before I knew the how much. I read it standing up, in my coat, with my phone flashlight held in my left hand. 4 pages. His handwriting, careful and deliberate, the print he had used his entire life. I read it once through quickly, and then I went back to the beginning and read it again, slowly, because the first time through I was still arriving at what he was telling me, and the second time through I needed to understand it fully. He explained it in the order he must have rehearsed many times in his own head. Why he had left the business to Scott. Not because he valued Scott more, but because leaving it divided would fracture it, and he knew, and he used the word knew, that Scott would not work alongside me and that the business would not survive the split. He had made a decision he was not proud of, and then he had spent 15 years doing the only thing he could think of to correct it. The residential cash stream, the small jobs, private homeowners, neighbors, clients who had always paid cash and whom Scott had never managed because Scott ran the commercial side. Donald had handled them himself until his health prevented it. The cash they paid had gone, every year for 15 years, not into the business accounts but into a parallel stream he maintained separately, into 2 savings accounts he had opened at a credit union in 2009. In my name. My social security number. Me as the sole signatory, since I was 16 years old, on accounts I had never known existed. $312,000. Documented. Withdrawable. In my name. And a fireproof case in a storage unit on Merchant Drive that he had been paying $87 a month to maintain for 15 years. Without telling my mother more than "there's something I'm taking care of," without telling my brother anything at all. And then, on the third page, in the same careful handwriting, "I watched you build your firm. I didn't say so. I should have said so. You're better at this than he is. I always knew that." I folded the letter. I put it in my jacket pocket. I sat down on the document case. There was nowhere else to sit. And I sat there for a while. I do not know how long. The storage unit was very quiet. Outside, I could hear the occasional car on Merchant Drive. I sat with the boxes and the fireproof cases and the cash box and the 15 years of my father's silence, organized by year in his handwriting. And I tried to understand what I was holding. Not the money, I mean what I was holding underneath the money, which was a man who had spent 30 years being wrong about something and could not say so while he was alive, so he spent 15 years saying it in a storage unit instead. One box at a time, 1 year's worth of documented cash at a time. An apology that required a key and a flashlight to find. Delivered after he was gone, in the dark, alone. Exactly the way he had always asked me to do things. I did not cry in the storage unit. I decided not to. I wanted to be clear-headed in the storage unit. I drove back to the highway, and I pulled into the parking lot of a gas station on I-40 with my hazards on, and I sat there for a while, and then I drove back to Asheville. What I did not do in the days that followed was call Scott. I needed to understand the full shape of what my father had left before I could have that conversation, and I needed to understand it with someone who could tell me what I was actually looking at from a legal standpoint. I retained Sylvia Crane, an estate attorney in Asheville, a methodical and precise woman who had clearly navigated more complicated family situations than this one and wore that experience with a useful calm. I brought her the documentation from the storage unit, all of it. The second letter, the account statements, 15 years of Donald's cash ledgers. Sylvia reviewed it. She was quiet for most of that conversation in the particular way that lawyers are quiet when they are assessing rather than deliberating. Then she told me what she saw. The accounts were legally mine, had been since 2009. Donald had established them correctly in my name with my social security number. The funds in them were mine without dispute. The question she wanted me to think carefully about was the origin of those funds, specifically, the years when Callahan Green was a shared family enterprise and the residential clients could be argued by a sufficiently motivated attorney to have been business clients. She was not saying there was a strong claim. She was saying that to close this cleanly, to ensure that Scott could never come back in 5 years with a revised argument, the right move was full disclosure now. Proactively, with a formal release. She was right. I knew she was right. I told her to draft the letter. It went to Scott's attorney on May 28th. It was 12 pages, including the account statements, a summary of the cash documentation, and the cover memo that was, as Sylvia described it, not an accusation but an accounting. It established what existed, what it was, and what it was legally. It invited Scott's attorney to review and respond. Scott received it the same day it was served. He called me that evening. I want to tell you about his voice, because there is the voice he had used in October when he called to tell me everything was being kept together. That was the voice of a man delivering information he considered settled. Logistics he was sharing out of courtesy. And then there was the voice he had when he called in May. It was the same voice in the technical sense. It used the same words and the same cadence. But there was something in the foundation of it that had changed. The certainty was gone. He sounded for the first time in my memory like someone who did not know what the ground was. He said, "He never told me about any of this." I said, "I know." He said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Since the 7th. Silence. A long one. Then, 3 weeks. "You sat on this for 3 weeks." I said, "I needed to understand it first." The legal meeting was June 11th at Sylvia's offices. I arrived early. I sat with my hands flat on the conference table and I thought, for a few minutes, about a dinner table in Knoxville, Tennessee, and a 9-year-old girl at it, and the direction a man's eyes went every night. And then the door opened and the attorneys came in. And Scott came in behind his attorney, a man named Russell Webb who had driven from Knoxville, and had the careful expression of someone who had spent the drive reviewing a situation he had not been adequately briefed on. Charles Hargrove was there as a courtesy to the estate. Sylvia sat beside me. I was ready. Sylvia walked through it in the order that was most useful: the legal status of the accounts first, then the 15-year history, then the documentation, then Exhibit A, which was Donald's second letter in its entirety. She read the relevant sections aloud. Russell Webb's face changed incrementally as she read. Not dramatically, he was too professional for dramatics, but the careful neutrality of his expression acquired a different quality as Exhibit A progressed. It was the expression of a man updating his assessment in real time. Scott, across the table, was quiet in a way I had never seen him quiet before. He had always been a man who filled space, who told you what he thought before you finished asking, who moved through rooms with the ease of someone who had never been uncertain about his welcome. He was not that person in Sylvia's conference room. He was someone sitting with something he had not expected, trying to find the edges of it. At some point during the accounting he said, "He set this up when she was 16. Sylvia said, "Correct." He said, "To no one in particular, to the middle of the table, I think. Or to some version of our father who was not in the room. He was doing this when I was running crews." I said nothing. Russell Webb asked at the appropriate moment whether there were grounds for a claim against the accounts given the potential business origin of some funds. Sylvia produced the second letter again. She directed his attention to the specific sections in which Donald documented his reasoning, his methodology, the separation he had deliberately maintained between the residential cash stream and the business accounts, and his explicit statement in his own handwriting, signed and dated, that the funds were intentionally set aside for me and were not, in his understanding, business assets. It was, as Sylvia said, the most thoroughly documented informal estate transfer she had encountered in 21 years of practice. Russell Webb looked at the letter. He looked at his client. He said carefully, "Scott, I think we need to accept the accounting." I watched my brother's face during the silence that followed. He was 33 years old. He had grown up with every advantage the business could offer: the paychecks, the training, the identity, the trucks with the family name on the doors. He had been handed 6 weeks ago the whole of what our father built, and he was sitting in Asheville looking at 41 boxes of documentation that proved our father had spent 15 years building something else, something parallel, something patient, something addressed to the daughter he had excluded from every conversation and had never once, at any table, said the right thing to. He didn't look angry. He looked, and I have thought about how to describe this many times since, like a man who has been standing in a building for his entire life and has just been told that the building has a foundation he did not know about. Not furious, not devastated, recalibrating, trying to reconcile the father he thought he understood with the father who had quietly spent 15 years being unable to say what he meant to his daughter's face, so he said it in a storage unit instead. He looked up. He said, "Did he ever tell you?" I said, "No. I found out the same night you did." He looked at the table. I signed the release documents. I stood. I shook Russell Webb's hand. I shook Hargrove's hand. I looked at Scott. He did not offer his hand and I did not reach. We stood for a moment on either side of the conference table, the two children of Donald Callahan with everything that table had ever held between us. I paused at the door. I turned back. I said, "He wrote that he always knew I was better at it than you. I want you to know that. Not to hurt you. Because I think if it were the other way, if he had written something like that about you, I would want someone to tell me." I left. Sylvia caught up with me in the parking lot. She said, "You handled that well." I said, "I've had a long time to practice." She asked what I was going to do with it. I thought about it for a moment. The money. The question. The parking lot on a June afternoon with the whole of what had just happened still finding its shape in me. I said, "I am going to buy the building. Expand the firm, maybe take on a junior partner." She said, "Good." We shook hands. I got in my car. I want to tell you what I did with the money, because it is the most Fiona Callahan thing I have ever done. And I think it is the right ending to this part of the story. The $312,000 cleared into my accounts by August. In September, I made an offer on the building Callahan Studio had been leasing $410,000, with the storage unit funds as the down payment and a commercial mortgage for the remainder. The offer was accepted. The closing was in October on a Wednesday morning at a title company in Asheville. I was the only one there from my side of the transaction, which is the only way I have ever done anything important in my life. I signed the documents in the order they were presented. I walked out with a building. I had a small brass plate made for the door. Callahan Studio, EST, 2021. I thought about adding something else. I decided against it. The plate says exactly what it needs to say. I call my mother once a week. We talk about her garden, about her friends, about the small, reliable things that are easier to talk about than the large, unreliable ones. In September, she said, "He was proud of you. He just didn't have the words." I said, "I know, Mom." And I do know. That is the specific difficulty I have sat with every day since May 7th. Not that I didn't know he loved me, but that knowing it and never hearing it are not the same thing. And I've spent 31 years understanding the difference between those two conditions from the inside. Scott called in October. He asked if I would be willing to consult on a commercial landscaping project Callahan Green was bidding, a hotel development in Knoxville that wanted a design architect attached. There was a pause in his voice when he asked that was different from any pause I had heard from him before. I told him I would look at the brief. I did look at it. The site has interesting topographic conditions. The design problems are the kind I find genuinely engaging. I have not decided yet, I'm thinking about it. My father spent 30 years not saying it to my face, and then he spent 15 years saying it in a storage unit, one banker's box at a time. I have thought about what I want to take from that. Not in the abstract, in the specific practical sense that I take from everything. Because I am my father's daughter in at least this way. I am interested in what the numbers mean, and I am interested in what to do next. The numbers mean that he knew. They mean he always knew. They mean that somewhere in the man who told me landscape architecture was drawing pictures of other people's work. There was also the man who opened a storage unit in 2009 and started filling it with proof that he understood exactly what I was worth. Those two men occupied the same body for 68 years. I did not get the one I wanted. I got the only one he could manage. The worst thing he ever did was not leaving the business to Scott. I want to be clear about that because I have had to become clear about it over many months of sitting with it. The worst thing he did was watch me build something from nothing, in the same industry he built his own life in, with the same instincts he had passed down without meaning to, through all those trade catalogs I read on his office floor, and never once pick up the phone. The money in that storage unit was not an inheritance, it was a confession. And I have spent a long time deciding whether a confession that comes 15 years too late counts as an apology. I think it counts as something. I am still working on what to call it. What I know is this: he could not hand me the business. He did not have it in him to do the thing that would have been right and would have been hard and would have required him to look at the shape of his own family clearly. So he did the only thing he had left. He spent 15 years in a storage unit proving he knew exactly what I was worth. And he left the door unlocked for the night I would come looking. I came looking. The door was open. The light was burned out, and I had my phone flashlight, and I went in alone the way he asked me to. The firm is mine. The building is mine. The brass plate on the door says Callahan Studio, established 2021, and every client who walks through that door is walking through something I built without a loan from my father, without my name on his trucks. Without a single conversation at that dinner table where his eyes came to rest on me the way they rested on my brother and stayed there. I built it anyway. I built it because it was the only option available to me, and I turned out to be very good at the only option available to me, which I think my father understood before I was ready to. I'll leave you with a question, because it is the one I have been turning over since May, and I want to know how you would answer it. If the apology came too late to change anything, if the proof arrived in a storage unit after the person was gone and you could see, clearly and completely, that they always knew, would that be enough for you? Or would you still need them to have said it out loud? Tell me in the comments. I am genuinely asking. The building is very beautiful in the morning. The light comes in from the east and hits the drafting tables and the plant samples and the presentation boards in a way that I could not have designed better if I had tried. I walk in every morning and I think, this is mine. This has always been mine. It just took a key and a flashlight and a man who could not say the right thing until he had no voice left to say it with. His name is not on my door. I am not ready for that yet. I am also not close to it. I'm thinking about it the way I think about a design problem that is almost solved. Carefully, without forcing it. Waiting for the moment when the right answer becomes obvious. That moment has not come yet, but I know how to wait.